Bruce, we've been listening to the voice of Terence McKenna, mostly on the Psychedelic Salon. You got to listen to him in person before his death. I think a lot of us, having listened to so much Terence McKenna, hear him just in our heads, even without listening to podcasts or CDs or anything. And the topic of novelty, and particularly the topic of 2012, has certainly been, I don't know about central, but definitely an integral portion of the whole Terence McKenna message. And now that 2012 is here, it seems like some of his predictions seem a little outlandish. If you just look around and look at the state of the world, it doesn't seem as though, events, novelty-generating events, or the wave of novelty through history is really accelerating quite as much as Terence would have said that it would by now. Or at least that's my impression. I wonder what your impressions are on how things are panning out in terms of Terence's vision of life in 2012 leading up to the summer or the winter solstice.
Well, I think it's important to sort of put Terence in historical context and in personal context. When I knew him in the late 1990s, we had conversations about these subjects, including the 2012 prophecy of his and others. And I think that, look at the times. The times were, the 1980s, 1990s, there was a great opening up, the launching of the birth of the internet, the global internet, the falling of the Berlin Wall, the technological gadgetry that was everywhere, that was propagating rapidly. But you also had the millennial fever going on. You had Y2K, and it was one of the reasons Terence moved full-time to Hawaii, is that he was really worried about Y2K. So there was in the personal sphere, Terence's life was accelerating very rapidly. He had become a kind of superstar on the circuit. There were a lot of stories about him. He was called the Altered Statesman, things like this. And the pace at which his writings were coming out, the talks that he did, all of this was just so intense for him that I remember being at his house in 1999 and him saying, I don't know how much more of this I can take. I'm getting so tired. This is why he was interested in virtual worlds, and it's why I was there, because he felt that he just couldn't keep up this pace. He needed to find a medium where he could reach his relatively small audiences without getting on a wide-body jet every time from Hawaii. So, at the same time, and it's a sad truth, Terence's mind was, in a sense, dissolving because the tumor that he was developing got up to the stage where he had a full seizure, and he lived only a slightly less than a year after that. So Terence was, in a sense, his own ingression into novelty, his own concrescence was occurring in his personal life. And I think, in a sense, looking forward, he probably couldn't imagine what his own life would be like 12, 13 years hence. So perhaps he met his own singularity, in a sense.
As we all will. It's interesting that you talk about how his life was in such a state of acceleration and how that influenced his message of accelerating ingression of novelty. I notice that my own views about where society is going tends to fluctuate in terms of my own experience, in terms of, how well I think I'm doing. And I've talked to other people about this, and it really seems that policymakers do this, and particularly financial elites do this. They themselves, are doing pretty well. Their portfolios are not as strong as they were, but certainly looking pretty strong. And it's very difficult for somebody in a position like that to entertain the possibility that perhaps, the growing financialization of our economy and the impacts of that is not necessarily a sign that things are going well. And I wonder just what prospect you see for escaping that sort of microcosm writ large style of viewing the world.
Here's a funny analogy for you. If any of the listeners have read the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov, there was this character named Harry Seldon, who was a sort of future histrionics person who, by the use of advanced Hewlett-Packard calculators or whatever in the 29th century, he was able to plot the course of future history. And so every 50 or 100 years, they would dust off a holographic projection of Harry Seldon, where he would be beamed like Princess Leia onto the table and say, well, it's such and such a year and you should be here. And then they realized that history was changed. History was not on Seldon's future course. So they said there must have been some kind of anomaly, and that was the mule. That was this rise of this personality who was changing history rapidly. So the question we have is, if Terence is our Harry Seldon, which is I really doubt, I don't know how handy he was with the Hewlett-Packard calculator. Is there some mule that came in to spoil our wonderful, glorious ingression into an ever better world? And is the mule the financial derivative? Is it the hubris of a superpower? Is it over commercialism? Is it radical extreme religion? What is this mule that has cast a shadow over the 21st century? Because certainly in the post Cold War period in the 90s, there was certainly a huge amount of optimism. And Mikhail Gorbachev has just written an article which talks about the lost opportunity at the end of the Cold War and how the so-called sole remaining superpower blew it for all of us, in a sense. And one of the things that's interesting is that the United States should have, in some sense, retired off its Cold Warriors, its Black Ops people, because these people were going to continue to try to find an enemy to keep their budgets and their reason for being around. So, did the enemy became, Islamic extremism, or what was the enemy for them? Is the enemy liberalism? So in a sense, this mentality that governed for 50 years in the Cold War carried on and led us into a lot more trouble, expense, needless invasions, those kinds of things. Were they the mule? So all things to think about it. But in Terence's era, he just didn't have this sort of rear view perspective that we now have looking back on the years leading up to this year.
Bruce, you have got some Terence McKenna clips that you have heard. I have not heard. If you would, though, introduce one, and we'll play it in as much as I will insert it into the podcast in the editing stage, and then perhaps you can summarize the content for me, and we can take the conversation in that direction.
Well, one of them, there's several variations on this theme. Terence talks about sort of the beginnings of the universe, the Big Bang, the formation of molecules and long-chain polymers and DNA and life. And then he goes into, and complexity or novelty increases in this novelty-conserving engine that is the universe, and it goes into mind. It goes into culture, technology, etc. And his theory then, it takes the great leap of saying, there is teleology. There is an end purpose to all this, and that there is something that he sometimes calls the transcendental object at the end of time, which is pulling the universe forward, i.e. the universe isn't just an expanding balloon with no, just willy-nilly. The universe is being pulled forward by this end goal, and that you can see the transcendental object in elevated states, and I believe he believes that on DMT and other psychedelics you kind of get a glimpse of this object, and that is, and I think his fundamental philosophy derived from Whitehead and others, and that in 2012 that his patterning on the calendar and all this ever-increasing waves and waves of complexification in society point to a 2012 sort of, pinprick where we all sort of, go out into this space of the transcendental object. So that's his great sweep of his greatest idea, and as he describes in this podcast, maybe the one that is the shakiest of his ideas is also the greatest of his ideas or of his theories. So that may be a good one to put out here, because this is January 3rd, 2012, and we're talking about it.
Well, let's listen to Terence talk about those ideas in his own voice and his own distinctive tonality.
Well, I talked this morning about how the story of the universe is that information, which I call novelty, is struggling to free itself from habit, which I call entropy, and that this process, which informs the whole history of the universe on all scales, chemical, biological, cultural, etc., is accelerating, speeding up. And it seems as if what wants to happen is the whole cosmos wants to change into information, or put another way, in a geometric model, all points want to become connected. The thing is achieved through connectivity. The path of complexity to its goals is through connecting things together. Well, if that's true, then you can imagine that there is an ultimate end state of that process. It's the moment when every point in the universe is connected to every other point in the universe. And if that's what the universe is trying to do, to overcome its dissipate state, its spread out state, and somehow function as a unitary monad, then this point does not lie too far ahead of us in time, given the acceleration rates of all these technical processes. So, at least locally. So on one level, I think there is a cultural singularity. What I mean by that is a place in our cultural development where we can't predict or understand what will happen to us. A kind of flip point, if you want, or doorway, if you want, or revelation, if you want. And it's built in to the structure of space and time. It's that novelty in its emergence is now operating at such a fine scale that it's actually reflected in the lives of individual people. The human adventure has become the cutting edge of cosmic destiny. But it won't always be so. It will actually move through the human domain and into smaller and more rapid and compressed domains of concrescence, and probably in our lifetimes. And what will this mean, or what will it look like? It seems to me it's just not possible to say, because we're too far away from it. Even though it's only 14 years in the future, if it's in 2012, those 14 years are going to be so mutational, so transformational, that right now in time we can't see around the corner. We're summoning strange helpers to our aid. The machines that we had such confidence in controlling are actually a kind of intellect-y of some sort that is alive and with us in the historical continuum and evolving at a far faster rate than we are. And what all this leads to and how it works is very, very difficult to predict. And I'm not a paranoid. I think it's very difficult to predict. I think we wished for transformation. Western civilization built it into its cultural agenda. Science delivered far more than we ever dreamed in terms of understanding of matter and energy and space and time. And now, under the aegis of market capitalism, where everything is in a state of furious competition, somebody is going to put something together that is just going to completely redefine and rewrite the nature of reality itself. And my bet is it will be some kind of a technology. It could be a drug. It could be a machine. would be nice to think that it might be a technique